Back on the record, the time is 2:22.
Doctor, I think at the time we broke for lunch, we were still addressing the question, what's something you recall discussing with him, meaning me, Mr. Ekdorf?
Right. Okay, so I think I pretty much got most of the general issues done in the morning. I haven't told you everything, but most of the things that I can generally recall, I'd say most of the issues. So that's, if you want me to go through more detail, I can, but I think that's probably sufficient.
So that question's over? I'm sorry, that answer's over?
That's correct.
Okay. Objection, non-responsive. Dr. Eagleman, I'm going to hand you what I've marked as Deposition Exhibit 1. Do you recognize Exhibit 1 to be a copy of your curriculum vitae?
Right, but it may not be the most updated. I don't know when this came out. I got an updated one here.
That's what I have.
Well, I understand that. You asked me,
Okay.
I answered.
Hand you what I've marked as
Just keep a pile.
Deposition Exhibit 2. Gene, do you want me to hand you the extra copies, or do
It
you
just
care?
depends what it is, so if I don't need it, I'll toss it, but
Okay.
I just want to make sure we have the right ones for the court reporter.
Do you recognize Exhibit 2 to be the introduction to your report in this matter?
Yes?
Ed, I'm going to keep all these right here for right now, if that's okay with you. Okay.
I'm going to hand you what I've marked as Exhibit 3. Do you recognize Exhibit 3 to be your report in this matter?
Part of the report, minus the introduction.
So Exhibit 2 and Exhibit 3 go together, and that's you're considering those two your report?
Yes?
Dr. Eagleman, did you meet Greg Pletz while he was alive?
No?
Have you performed any sort of neurobehavioral evaluation of Mr. Pletz?
No?
Did you perform any neuropsychological assessment of Mr. Pletz?
No?
Have you reviewed any of Mr. Pletz's medical records?
I think I've seen some of them, yes.
Have you seen any medical records of Mr. Pletz from the days when he was playing college football at the University of Texas?
Not that I can recall.
Dr. Eagleman, you are not certified as an industrial hygienist, correct?
Yes?
Yes, that is correct.
Yes?
You are not a practicing industrial hygienist, correct?
No.
No, that's not correct? Or no, you're not a practicing industrial hygienist?
No, that's not correct.
When did you begin practicing industrial hygiene?
1982 or 83?
Do you recall ever testifying that you were not a practicing industrial hygienist?
No?
You were not an engineer, correct?
Object to the form.
I'll rephrase. Dr. Eagleman, you are not an engineer, right?
Well, I do and publish on things related to that could be considered engineering.
Do you have a engineering degree?
No,
Are you licensed as an engineer?
no.
Do you practice engineering in any state?
Well, I practice with my offices to the extent that I do engineering, so that would be Massachusetts and Rhode Island when I'm in Rhode Island.
Are you licensed as an engineer in Massachusetts?
No,
Are you licensed as an engineer in Rhode Island?
no,
You are not a pathologist, correct?
I'm not a board certified pathologist, correct. I do review pathology and incorporate evaluation of pathology in the practice of medicine that I perform.
Do you have a degree in pathology?
No,
You're not a neurologist, correct?
I practice neurology, I do neurology, I've done neurology, I teach about neurology.
You do not hold yourself out as an expert in neurology, do you?
Yes, I do.
You hold yourself out as an expert in neurology?
Well, my understanding of an expert is I know more than the layman. Yes, I teach about neurology in my course, for example.
Are you board certified in neurology?
No,
Do you have any special training or certification in neurology?
yes.
What is that?
Well, it starts in undergraduate school. I had training in neurology and as part of the coursework I did in biology and in my major in molecular biology. Then, of course, I took neurology as a medical student, both the basic sciences of neurology and also in neurology as part of my clinical training as a physician. In addition, I did rotation in rehabilitation medicine, which incorporated a lot of neurology and neurology issues. In addition, then I went to public health school. In public health school, neurologic conditions were certainly part of the study of toxicology. A lot of toxicologic exposures cause neurologic problems, as do injuries. I was trained in occupational medicine, so I got training in the neurologic aspects of injuries as part of my public health training, which was part of my residency in occupational medicine. Then I did participate in training on neurologic topics as they came up while I was at NIOSH in my residency in occupational medicine. So they would have periodic lectures, some of which would relate to neurologic issues, particularly issues related to exposures that could affect brain and brain function, or peripheral neuropathy related to toxic exposures, particularly, for example, I think we participated in a study on hexane and other toxic substances that cause peripheral neuropathy, pardon me. When I was in Mississippi practicing, there were a lot of neurological cases that we saw. So I saw them in the clinical practice of medicine, both as a medical student and as a resident and as a practicing physician. After my residency in occupational and environmental medicine, I did a third residency of preventive medicine, some of that related to prevention of neurologic diseases and treatment and public health issues related to neurologic conditions. During my clinical practice years, and I practiced medicine in a clinic that I ran from 1989 till 2002, I saw a lot of patients with neurologic problems, and I treated them clinically and evaluated them clinically. I would see patients with stroke, I would see patients with head trauma, I would see patients with peripheral neuropathies. So I saw a lot of patients with neurologic disease during that time period, and I would read and study and went to lectures on time to time, part of my continuing medical education program in neurologic topics. That was during the entire time period. So I have to take 50 to 100 hours of of CME credits. A lot of those would be in neurology. There would be grand rounds. There were grand rounds that were held on neurologic topics. I would go to those. I would get CME credits for those as well. Let's see what else training-wise. I think that's most of it. I think that's most of it. There may some other things come to my mind.
Objection non-responsive. When did you begin holding yourself out as an expert in neurology?
Object to the form.
Well, I held myself out as an expert in the practice of internal medicine. Neurology is part of that. So people would come to me with neurologic problems. So that's part of practicing internal medicine. So that's when in terms of when I started my clinical practice, I would say. Although and also at NIOSH, I would say that people would ask, I would participate in issues related to neurologic questions. And so during my time at NIOSH, I probably did it as well. Even during my residency, we would see neuro. So I mean, I would see a patient and they would have a neurologic problem, and I would see them. So I guess in your terms, I would be holding myself out as an expert in neurology because I would be treating them for a neurologic condition. So really the whole time period after medical school.
Do you recall ever testifying that you do not hold yourself out as an expert in neurology?
No.
But just so I understand, is it your testimony that by holding yourself out as an expert in internal medicine, you are also holding yourself out as an expert in neurology?
No, not exactly. But yes.
You're not a historian, are you?
Oh, yes, I am. I published a lot on the history of medicine, history of medical history of, particularly in the area of medicine where we talk about corporate interventions in science, corporate influence on science. Absolutely, I'm a historian of medicine.
You do not have a degree in history, do you?
I do not have a degree in history. That is correct.
Other than working as a doctor and as you say, as a providing a history of medicine, have you worked as a historian in any other aspect? You may rephrase that.
Let me see if I can look at the question and answer it.
Let me try to rephrase. I think I stuttered in it. It wasn't a very good question. Other than a historian of medicine, have you worked as a historian in any other field?
Object to the form. You can answer if you understand
Well,
it, Doctor.
do you include science as in medicine? Or are you separating science per se and medicine?
Well, I asked if you were a historian, and you said you were a historian of medicine. And so I'm asking, are you a historian of any other field?
Well, I included in my definition of medicine science. So I was trying to see if you were making a distinction there in your question. So if you're not, medicine, my definition of medicine includes science that goes into medicine as well as the practice of medicine per se, for example.
Have you ever worked as a historian other than as a historian of science or medicine?
Well, I teach about history. Would you call that different from work? I don't really understand the question. I mean, in my course, I do a lot of, historically, in my course, I've taught about a lot of history of medicine and science. That's a major part of the course.
Any fields other than history? I'm sorry. Are you a historian of any field other than medicine and science?
Public health. So anything that relates to public health. So, for example, the history that I did here this morning on the NCAA, that would be part of public health, and I'm a historian of that. So I would evaluate the history of what I just did this morning for 3.5 hours. I would call that, in part, the work of a historian who knew a lot about medicine.
The work you discussed this morning related to the NCAA, Have you performed that work outside of litigation?
Yeah, my publications are not part of litigation. So if you look at my publications, here, let me get my CV, and I'll give you some examples since you seem to be confused.
Well, and
Okay,
my,
so
my question relates to, as to the NCAA.
I think you
well, that's
understood
not
the
a question. Okay, so I don't. You want to try ask when you say my question relates to as to the NCAA, the original question was the work you've discussed this morning related to the NCAA. Have you performed that work outside of litigation? That was the previous question. So your modification of that previous question makes no sense to me.
Let me try again. This morning, you described some history of the NCAA, correct?
In part,
Okay. Have you done that work for reasons other than litigation?
oh yes. You mean is the NCAA work other than for litigation?
Have you researched the history of the NCAA for purposes other than litigation?
Sure.
Name one person who has hired you to do that that was not for purposes of litigation.
Hired? No one hired me to do that.
Nobody has ever hired you to research the history of the NCAA outside of litigation.
Per se, correct. But, I mean, I've taught about NCAA concussions in my course historically, outside of litigation.
Objection.
But Brown didn't hire me for that specific purpose. I get to create my own syllabus. So I decide what goes in.
Objection non-responsive. Did you add the research related to the NCAA before you were hired as an expert in litigation related to the NCAA or after?
Oh, I think it's been there before. I think I've talked about this before in the class.
You're not a lawyer, are you?
I'm not legally allowed to practice anywhere in the United States.
You're not licensed as a lawyer anywhere.
Correct.
You do not have a law degree.
Correct.
You do not have a degree in epidemiology, correct?
Well, not exactly. No, not correct.
You have a medical degree.
Yes.
Are you saying that is a degree in epidemiology?
Check to the form.
No.
What degree do you have in epidemiology?
I graduated from the National Institutes of Health Epidemiology Training Program,
When did you do that?
1984.
Have you ever testified that you do not have a degree in epidemiology?
Not per se, I don't think. I think the question was better framed than the one you made.
When is the last time you actually participated in an epidemiological study?
Check to the form.
Well, I'm doing one now.
In terms of generating original data?
Yes.
You're doing one right now.
Well, not as we sit here today. Right now I'm being deposed. Okay, but for example, I discussed the data for an epidemiologic study last week, and I guess we're receiving the data this week or next week.
And
the week before, I was discussing another epidemiologic study that was my idea. So they're gonna make me a co-author when they do it. So that was a week and a half ago. But there's two current epidemiologic studies that I'm involved with apparently.
So there's one epidemiological study that has not started yet, correct? But you've talked about it.
Well, I think it started because I think after I talked about it, it started.
Have you done any work on that study yet?
Yes, I met with the researcher, my co-researchers on that study. We discussed it. We laid out how it would be done, and they're working out whether they need to get IRB approval, et cetera, and what we need to do to write the protocol. So sure.
Does that epidemiological study relate to chronic traumatic encephalopathy?
No. Well, it could, but it's not designed for that single purpose.
Okay. And I think you mentioned it this morning. I just want to be clear about it on the record, and maybe it'll save us some time. There's punch drunk and dementia pugilistica, correct? And those are the same thing, different terms for the same thing.
More or less.
And I believe you testified this morning that punch drunk, in your opinion, is also known as CTE, correct?
I don't think that's exactly what I said.
That they're the same thing. You believe they're the same thing?
No, I didn't say that.
You don't believe that punch drunk and chronic traumatic encephalopathy are the same thing?
To the form.
They're not the same thing. They're different things.
There's a 1928 article that you discussed earlier. I think it was 1928 dealing with punch drunk. Is that correct?
No, Martland dealt with CTE.
Are you aware of any? So, if I refer to punch drunk and I refer to CTE,
Excuse me.
to you, those are two totally different things.
Check to the
No,
form.
not exactly.
They're different things, but they overlap somewhat.
That's a really bad question. And
Well,
I don't know if I can't answer that yes or no.
okay. So, I guess at the end of the day, if I refer to CTE, I can't assume that punch drunk or dementia pugilistica and CTE are all the same thing. I need to ask you about punch drunk and CTE separately. Is that right?
That's an impossible question for me to answer.
You would not refer to punch drunk as also being CTE. Is that right?
I might, depends on context. Not to adopt Dr. Heinlein's excuse for not answering questions, but yes, I might. There might be overlap, so, depending on the context. But they're different in general, but can be related.
Can you
This
provide?
becomes a metaphysical question until you get a better question.
Okay. Can you provide me one context in which chronic traumatic encephalopathy and punch drunk are the same?
The symptoms can be the same. Some of the symptoms can be the same.
But in terms of would you call them diseases?
Check to
Punch
the
drunk
form.
is not a disease.
Okay.
Punch drunk is a description of what happens to someone when they get punched. They act as if they were drunk. And there were a certain set of symptoms associated with drunkenness that was associated with getting punched.
That's a point that I wanted to talk to you about, because you mentioned that earlier. Is there a latency period related to punch drunk?
Define latency period.
Well, for example, Mr. Pletz played collegiate football from 1967 to approximately 1971, correct?
Correct.
And I think his symptoms of what plaintiff alleges as CTE, I believe, began to arise around mid 2000s, 2007, 2008 maybe.
Object to the form mischaracterizes the evidence.
Is that your understanding or no?
That question cannot be answered by me. You can only answer that question. You're the only one who can answer the question you just asked.
Do you know when Mr. Pletz first started seeing a doctor due to symptoms of dementia or forgetfulness?
Check to the form.
I don't recall the first visit for that, no.
Let's say the latency period would be about 30 years. Would punch drunk have a latency period of 30 years?
Check to the form.
Well, you know, punch drunk is not a medical diagnosis. So why don't you be a little more specific about what you mean by latency period, because you still haven't explained that, okay, and what you mean by punch drunk. I explained what I meant by punch drunk, okay, in the beginning of my talk, my answer to your first question, third question, fifth question, whatever it was, okay? So but what you're asking does not make sense in that context.
It's been a long time since you might have talked about that, so let me try again. Dementia pugilistica. Is there a latency period related to dementia pugilistica?
Well, if you're assuming that you're emphasizing the dementia part, and I'm not sure it was always in the literature noted to be a dementia construct as we understand dementia today, there would be a latent period. If there was, if they were just calling the symptoms, signs and symptoms that you developed after getting hit in the head by fists, also dementia pugilistica, because the symptoms are the same, then there would be a brief latent period of seconds, sometimes, or minutes, hours. So it depends on that issue. I don't recall enough about the various uses of the dementia pugilistica term. In other words, whether that was restricted entirely to dementia symptoms that would occur many years after getting hit in the head during boxing, or whether that was also referred to, or also used to refer to symptoms that occurred shortly after getting hit in the head.
Let me just understand this. Punch drunk, the term punch drunk and the term dementia pugilistica, according to you, cannot be used interchangeably in all contexts.
I don't know. It could be by some people. These are not medical standard terms, right? So I have no idea. I mean, punch drunk was used in lay press, right? Often, right? More in lay press probably than in medical press. So it's not that it's not a medical issue. It's alone. I mean, there's some medical articles that talk about it as well. So it's not easy for me to figure out exactly what you're talking about, because there's a lay understanding, there's a professional understanding, and the professional understanding is not an in-depth professionalized understanding, because medical people, I don't think even then, that is in the 20s and 30s, would come in and say, I have present a patient with punch drunkenness. They would describe it with more medical words. They wouldn't say, I got a punch drunk patient. I don't think they refer to it that way. I could be wrong, but I wasn't around in the 20s and 30s to see those presentations. But my impression is they would not refer to that way.
Well, what I want to ask is your understanding and how you would use those terms, okay?
I don't use those terms except as I describe how they were used historically.
Okay.
Okay. In my normal discussion of medicine and things, the only time I use those terms is when I'm saying people describe getting punch drunk from boxing in the 20s and 30s. I did exactly what I said here. By the way, this brought up something that I forgot, so let me just throw it in here from my discussions with Mr. Egdorf. The other thing we discussed that I forgot to mention was after there was a single death from boxing, I think it was Wisconsin, 1961 or 2, boxing was eliminated as an NCAA sport. One death, no more boxing, just by comparison to what's happened in football. In terms of NCAA power to do something about a problem that would eliminate it, and B, their actual doing that with just a single death, compared to what they do with football. But forget that, just came to me while you're talking about this.
Objection non-responsive. Do you believe that the NCAA should have eliminated college football after a single person died playing college football?
I don't have an opinion on that, but it's certainly a possibility, like they did it with boxing. Certainly around 1900 that was discussed.
Going back to the epidemiological study, you said there's 2 of them that you're working on currently. One of them you've discussed, and I guess there's a distinction. Another one you are currently generating original data for?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Okay. So the one that you've just discussed with the other doctors, does that one relate to punch drunkenness?
It depends. It's not designed to do that. Okay, but it could pick up signs and symptoms that could have been historically associated with what was defined as punch drunkenness.
Is the purpose of that epidemiological study to determine the causation of punch drunkenness?
Not per se, no. But the purpose of that study is to determine whether a group of workers have an increased risk of any number of diseases, including, punch drunkenness is not a medical term, right? So, no one's doing any studies to look at punch drunkenness per se. But if you want me to interpret punch drunkenness as the signs and symptoms associated with head trauma or other exposures to chemicals or other things, then the study that I'm discussing might pick up causes of that, either from workplace trauma or from substance abuse or other things.
The epidemiological study you were just talking about, that's the one where you were discussing with the other doctors. I want to now focus on the one that you're actually generating original data for.
Mm-hmm.
You with me?
Yeah.
For that study, is the focus of that study to determine a causal connection for chronic traumatic encephalopathy?
No.
before those two epidemiological studies, what was the last epidemiological study you participated in which you generated original data?
Well, probably the paper that we did, we evaluated original data in a paper published last year.
What about where you generated original data?
We'll define generate original data.
Where you came up with the data for the epidemiological study?
What do you mean came up with? Define came up with.
You determined how that data was going to be gathered, and you went about gathering it for purposes of the study.
Well, most epidemiologic studies, you don't determine how the data was going to be gathered because it's already gathered in some form. Death certificates already exist. Medical hospital records already exist. So we would, for example, in the study we're talking about, we're getting death records and death certificates. So now in the study that I was mentioning, which was the last one before that one, we looked at the raw data of reports about occupational exposures, and we looked at the raw information that had been collected during the course of people creating registry data, and we analyzed that data. So at least as far as part of your answer, that would certainly be relevant. But I didn't generate the original data, like the forms that were filled out. We used the forms that were filled out and reanalyzed it for a question.
Have you ever participated in an epidemiological study focused on playing football?
No. But that's a good idea.
Have you ever participated in an epidemiological study focused on long-term effects of concussions?
No.
Have you ever participated in an epidemiological study related to long-term effects of mild traumatic brain injury?
No.
Have you ever participated in an epidemiological study related to long-term effects of repeated head injury?
No.
Have you ever done a case study of an individual college football player or players as a group?
No.
Have you ever done a case study of an individual high school football player or players as a group?
Case. You mean published? I mean, I talked to you about Sheely this morning. I mean, I evaluated individual case for sudden impact syndrome, but I haven't published that case. But another good idea.
You're counting your work on the Sheely case as a case study?
It's a study of a case. I haven't published that study. Should I publish the Sheely case, it would be a case study.
Okay.
I hadn't got around to that, but thank you for reminding me.
That's what I'm here for.
I was wondering, but I like your suggestions. They're excellent.
Have you ever done a case study of an individual NFL player or players as a group?
No. Could someone just get me some ice and water, please?
Now, I know you're a medical doctor. Do you have admitting privileges in any hospital?
No.
When is the last, have you ever had admitting privileges in a hospital?
Sure, until February this year. I'm 65. I retired from clinical practice.
When is the last time
You
you...
didn't send me a birthday card or anything.
I didn't know.
You've
don't
done
let-
all this research on me, It's
Well,
I figured you'd know my birthday.
You don't talk to me off the record, so I wouldn't know. When is the last time you admitted a patient in a hospital?
Oh, probably 12, 13 years ago, maybe longer.
And you said you retired, so you don't have a clinic anymore where you see patients?
I still see patients in my office sometimes. Not many, but I see some.
When was the last time you saw a patient?
A month and a half ago.
Do you consider your office a clinic?
I don't understand what you mean by that.
Didn't you have a clinic at one point that you sold?
Yeah, I had a full clinic. Yeah, that was a huge place. I mean, 7 examining rooms, an X-ray machine, pulmonary function tests, lab, everything. I mean, I don't have that.
When
I
did
have an examining room. I have an examining table. I have the equipment that I need to do physicals. I do them, and I do, and I have. I mean, that's what I have. I don't have an X-ray machine or more than one examining table.
the full-blown clinic you were just describing?
Yeah,
When did you sell that?
2001, 2002.
Have you ever diagnosed a patient with CTE?
Probably in my practice.
You recall diagnosing a patient with CTE
I think it probably happened.
before they had passed away?
Sure.
You diagnosed them based on clinical symptoms?
Right. You don't do brain biopsies. That's the only way to make the 100% diagnosis.
The patient that are you thinking of a specific person when you're answering yes, or you just think maybe at some point in time you might have?
No, I think I'm pretty sure I did. I can't remember the person. The clinic was open from 89 to 2001 or 2. I can't remember a particular patient, but I saw a lot of people with dementia, and so I think some of them probably had trauma.
Do you know if any of the patients that you diagnosed with CTE based on clinical symptoms were ever later confirmed after they had passed away by a brain biopsy?
No.
Have you ever treated a patient who suffered a concussion and then determined whether or not that patient could return to play a sport?
Oh yeah, that happened.
A patient?
That was the question, yes.
How often did you do that?
It was periodic in the clinic. I'd see people with concussions.
What sports did they play?
Well, they played all kinds of sports: soccer, football, basketball.
When's the last time you did that?
2001, 2002.
Have you ever perform exams to qualify people to play I'm sorry, let me start over. Did you ever perform exams to qualify people to play football before there was ever an issue? So, for example, not because they had a concussion or because they wanted to return to play, but just in the beginning of the season, examine a player and say, yeah, you're good to go play?
Yes.
At what level were you qualifying people to play football?
Some in the junior high school and high school level. Probably those would be the levels. I might have done a college kid or two.
At what time period were you, do you recall doing this?
Started in the mid-'70s and then through the clinic time.
So through about 2001?
Right. Now there's gaps in there because I did, I was in public health school and doing a residency, so that's the time range.
When you qualified those individuals to play football, did you ask them about their history of concussions?
No.
Did you give them a baseline test by which concussions could later be measured?
No.
When you were performing these exams, did you have a checklist that was provided by some governing body? So, for example, whoever was in charge of rules for junior high school football or high school football, did you have a checklist that you were following to qualify an individual to play football?
Sometimes they might have had a form to fill out. Yes, I think so.
But in terms of what you did to determine whether or not the person was qualified to play football, was there were you following a standard given to you by somebody else, the governing authority, or were you relying on your own standard of care as a doctor and your own experience and knowledge?
If
Back
the,
to the form.
it was, if there was a form to fill out, and I think there were forms to fill out, then I filled out the form and did a test that were on the form. If there was no form to fill out and I just had to like write on a prescription, Sammy can play football, then I relied on my own clinical assessment.
When there was a form, did you limit your analysis to just the items on the form, or did you also rely on your own clinical assessment and your own knowledge and skill as a doctor?
The latter,
You also relied on your knowledge and skill as a doctor?
yes.
Have you ever written an article on chronic traumatic encephalopathy?
No,
Have you ever written an article on punch drunkenness?
no,
Have you ever written an article on dementia pugilistica?
no.
Those are all good ideas, though, Danny.
Have you ever written an article on concussions and making the determination of when a person should return to play a sport?
No,
You've mentioned this before. You teach one class at Brown University called Science and Power, a Bioethical Inquiry, correct?
no, the course name's changed.
What's the new course name?
What's the new course name?
Science and Power, the Corruption of Public Health.
I didn't get that.
Science and Power, the Corruption of Public Health. Thanks.
You're not a full-time faculty member at Brown University, are you?
That's correct.
It's correct, you're not a full-time faculty member.
Yes,
Your position at Brown University is not a paid position, correct?
no, it's now paid
When did you start getting paid by Brown University?
with this course.
With the new course name?
With this year, yes, this year. I get money.
You've been testifying in lawsuits since about 1984, correct?
Yes?
And you've been testifying in asbestos litigation since 1987, correct?
No, I think earlier. I think 84, 85.
And you stated in 2004 that you've testified in trials and depositions over 450 times. Does that sound right?
No recollection of that.
Have you testified in trials and depositions over 450 times?
Sure, yes.
Over 650 times?
You mean days or cases?
Well, taking testimony in trials and testimony in depositions, how many times have you provided testimony?
Okay. I don't think I've done 450 cases, so I may be wrong if that's. I've given days of testimony that many days. I mean, at my busiest, I think I did about 15 to 25 cases in a year. I don't think I ever did more than that. And last couple of years I haven't done much at all. I think 450 might be a reasonable number of the total cases over 30 years.
No, objection non-responsive. Let me just make sure I'm being clear about this. since 1984, you have testified in trials and in depositions at least 450 times, correct?
Object to the form.
You mean 450 different cases?
I mean, you have sat down to provide expert testimony either at a trial or at a deposition 450 times or more.
Object to the form. I don't know if you're intending to, I think you're misleading. That's why he's asking you, do you mean days? He might testify 10 different times in the same case because he goes 10 days in a row.
I'm not counting days.
Well, that's what he's asked you to clarify, and you keep saying it the same way. I think
Okay,
that's the
well,
problem.
that's fair. I'll clarify. I'm not talking about days. If you sit down for one deposition and that deposition took 3 days, I'll count that as one deposition. All right.
Okay, then I think 450 may be right. I don't have a record of it. That's probably right.
Do you recall testifying in 2004 that you thought you testified in trials and in depositions over 450 times?
No, I don't have a recollection. But then the question's whether the question was as vague and ambiguous as the way you just said it. Is it days or is it cases? If it said cases, that would be specific. If it said testified, how many times, then that's pretty vague. I mean, I've been on the stand in a case for a week.
Okay.
10 days. I did it, at least one 10-day deposition. So when somebody doesn't be clear, I'm going to count every one of those days as a day testifying.
As a separate deposition?
Usually. It depends. I mean, I don't know how I interpreted the question at the time. You're asking me how I interpreted a question 14 years ago, and I don't remember.
Okay. Of the 450 times you've testified, okay, the overwhelming majority of the time you testify at the request of plaintiff's attorneys, correct?
That's correct.
Do you know how many times you have testified at the request of a defendant?
Actually given testimony or been a witness for?
I'm not sure how those are distinction.
You could be retained and not testify, ever
Well,
testify.
Yeah, I'm talking about how many times have you been called to testify at the request of a defendant?
Probably several hundred. Most of the work I do now is at the request of defendants. For the last 3 or 4 years, that's been the case.
Just in the last 3 or 4 years?
Right. That's a lot of cases. But, it's a vague and ambiguous question.
I'll let counsel take care of that.
Doctor, we're about 55 minutes, so when you feel like you need a break, feel free to speak up.
We could take a break.
You want to go ahead and do that now? Okay, thank you.
Going off the record, the time is 3:16.